Good evening, and welcome to this installment of Women in War. I'm your host, Larry Capetto. The Vietnam War was a reflection of the troubled times in our country in the 1960s and early 1970s. Over 9 million military personnel served on active duty during the Vietnam era. Nearly 3 million Americans served in country. 7,500 women served in Vietnam. Almost 85% of them were nurses. On today's program, we will feature the inspiring story of one of those Vietnam nurses, Lou Eisenbrandt. Lou served with the 91st Evac hospital in Chu Lai. She experienced firsthand the horrors and ravages of war. Please join with me in honoring and saluting one of America's heroes, Lou Eisenbrandt, on this edition of Women in War.
From October of 1969 through October of 1970.
One tour then.
One tour.
And did you enlist or drafted or what happened to you?
Well, as a woman, we weren't drafted. I guess you would say we enlisted. I signed up at the end of my junior year in nurses training. And then I served, technically my senior year I was considered on active reserve status, went to school, and then I was required to serve 2 years after that, after I graduated.
Were you like a lot of the young men at the time? Did you feel a duty to serve your country, or what sparked that interest?
Two very practical reasons. One was I wanted a means of paying back my parents who had paid for my nursing education, which was very minimal in those days, but we didn't have much to start with, and I wanted to be able to do that. And secondly, I grew up in Southern Illinois, very close to Scott Air Force Base, which was a huge Air Force base, and all my high school friends were Air Force brats. And there was no money in my family for travel, and I thought this was my chance to do as the posters said and see the world. Now, I had in mind Germany, England. I didn't have Vietnam, but when you say yes to Uncle Sam, you go where they send you. I graduated in June of '68, and in November I was sent to Fort Sam Houston, Texas for officers' basic training for 6 weeks, and then got orders for Fort Dix, New Jersey, which was my first duty assignment. I was at Fort Dix for about 9 months and got a manila envelope in the mail one day and said, "Congratulations, you're going to Vietnam."
That was it?
That was it. I guess I wasn't necessarily overly fearful. I'm sure my parents were terrified. But my roommate that I had at Fort Dix had gotten orders about 6 months prior. So I knew that a lot of women were going. So I probably nervous, just not sure what to expect, because I hadn't been very far from home at that point. When you fly into Vietnam, the first thing you notice is brown. It's a lush country, but when I arrived, it was rainy season, monsoon season, and so the water, you fly over the rivers and it's very brown. You open the door to the plane and there's an incredible blast of hot, humid air. Smells, a lot of different smells. At that point, though, you're flying into a base, so it's not like being among the people, and so it didn't have the same impact that it does once you get off at your duty assignment, and then it really does sort of hit you. I had no specific training at all. I served my first 3 months after I received my duty assignment and was sent up to the 91st Evac. I spent the first 3 months on a medical ward, seeing anything from hepatitis, malaria, jungle rot, which is what you get when you walk in water in combat boots for days on end and don't dry your feet out, intestinal worms, anything that was not a war wound I saw for 3 months. And then I was asked by the chief nurse if I would consider moving down to what we would call the emergency room, which was R&E, receiving an emergency, and so I spent the last 8 months in the emergency room. We were a full I guess you'd say a full-service hospital. We had all the normal things that a hospital would have. We also had a Vietnamese ward, so we saw Vietnamese civilians if villages got hit. We had a POW ward, so we saw Viet Cong and NBA. We had OR and recovery and all that sort of stuff, intensive care and the ER. In terms of particularly once I moved to the emergency room, the caseload varied from day to day. I mean, I remember working a shift and had one guy come in with an ingrown toenail. I also remember the day that a village got hit, a Vietnamese village, and we had 99 patients within the 12-hour span that I was on duty. So it varied dramatically. The 91st was a series of metal Quonset huts, which is what many of the Evac hospitals were. In terms of what we saw, absolutely everything. Like I said, it varied from the ingrown toenail to medical issues, a lot of casualties. And the casualties, I would say, if I had to say what did we see the most of, it would have been what we called frag wounds or shrapnel. When you blow something up, you get little tiny pieces of metal that break off, and depending on where they lodge in the body, you can either live with lots of tiny wounds, or you can take one to the aorta and die within a very short period of time. I saw many amputees, 1, 2, 3 limbs, head injuries, lots of gunshot wounds. For those who have never seen one, it makes most gunshots, most bullets make a very small entry wound, very large exit wound. So some of those were very deceptive. First thing we would do in the emergency room was to cut the clothes off of whoever came in so we could totally assess their wounds, because there was a wide variance. Most of our patients either came by ambulance or helicopters, probably more by helicopters than anything else. And they would come in all hours of the day and night. We worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week, so 12 hours on and 12 hours off. And everybody, civilian, in terms of casualties, Marine, obviously the units that were close by we saw more of, but we would see all the different branches of service, as well as Vietnamese civilians, like I said. One thing you never forget are white phosphorus burns, horrendous damage to a person, and there is a smell that to this day I will never get out of my head. I will never forget the smell of that, because it continues to burn the skin. I do remember well a young man who came in and was a double amputee. He'd lost both of his legs, and he'd also taken a gunshot wound to the chest. And so when we stripped him down and rolled him over, his back stayed on the litter. I will never forget that as long as I live. He actually lived long enough through surgery that we evac'd him out to Japan, so I have no idea what happened to him after that. The other one that really stands out in my mind was a young man from the South who I met the day I came in country. He came in with me. We sort of became friends, and he was assigned to a unit not far from our hospital. Came in early, a couple months after we got there, with some of his men who'd been wounded, and he had some light wounds. It wasn't a big deal. Went back out, and a couple months later he came, or probably 6 or 7 months later, he came back in again, and he was peppered from head to toe with shrapnel. And I didn't happen to be assigned to him. I was assigned to another a patient on another litter. But when they took him into the ER, into the OR, my friend who was working on him said, he'll probably lose both of his legs. And that was the only time that I would say, lost it. I just simply had to leave, because I felt a really close personal attachment. I did follow up with him actually afterwards. I went down to Fort Benning, Georgia, which is where he was. He still had his legs, but he wasn't able to use them at all. And I think about him often and wonder if he still has his legs or if he finally lost them. I have a saying that I've always contended was the case in Vietnam, and that was that we worked very hard and we played very hard. I felt, for myself personally, I needed to decompress at the end of my shift. Now, when you work in the emergency room, anytime you'd hear more than 3 helicopters coming in, you would report whether it was your shift or not. But yes, there was drinking. There was lots of drinking that went on. I know there were drugs. I personally did not get involved with drugs, but I know drugs were an issue. I don't think so much at the hospitals as, with the guys out in the bush. You partied hardy because you had to do something to forget. I also kept a journal, so writing helped. I think the people that really struggled with like PTSD when they came home were those that didn't give themselves an outlet, because you cannot do that and then go back to your room and sit and think about that all night until you go on duty again. You had to kind of take yourself out of the situation. The first week that I was in the emergency room, it was tough, because you saw things you had never seen before, and I will never see again. No matter what kind of trauma nursing you do back here, it can't compare with what I did on a daily basis. But at the same time, you do have to develop a persona that says, I'm going to do what needs to be done, because I would have been useless if I had fallen apart, every time we got a casualty in. And in terms of where we were, what we did, usually the corpsmen met the helicopters that would land on the helipad was literally right outside the emergency room. I mean, there was they carried them on gurneys. It was a very short distance. Usually those were met by the corpsmen, and so we usually stayed inside the building unless there was some sort of issue. I would say several times a week we would get in either KIA, killed in action, DOA, dead on arrival, in body bags. Those would go to what was called graves and then shipped back to this country. And occasionally we would get in guys that when the triage process was done, it was determined that there was no way to save their life. And what we usually did, if there were enough of us nurses, and there were only 2 or 3 of us on duty at a time, depending on how many casualties, they were usually put on a gurney back against the wall with a screen, and one of us would sit and hold their hand until they died, because there wasn't much else we could do. I remember on numerous occasions, if they were conscious, most of them weren't, but if they were, or the guys that came in that weren't quite so badly wounded, would look up and look at you and say, hey, you look like my girl back home. I get goosebumps thinking about that. So it was a little comfort to them, and yes, holding hands was good, and we tried to do that whenever we had enough people on hand to do that. Well, most of them that were that close to death were not conscious to be saying much of anything. It was more a breathing. But we were just doing what we could, and there were times that they'd say, am I going to die? And of course we would say, no, we're going to patch you up, you'll be fine. And sometimes we were able to, but many times we weren't. Basically, the only care that casualties got before they came to our hospital was by the aidman out in the field, and he would slap on dressings. Maybe there was a battalion aid station where they'd start an IV, and that was all that they would get before they came into our hospital. So we did that. We gave meds. We just did everything there was that needed doing. And you didn't ask for a doctor's order. You didn't have to record. I mean, you did try to record what you'd done, but it's quite different from nursing today. Occasionally, we would get patients from underground hospitals. The VC had a whole series of tunnels, 270 kilometers down at Cu Chi alone. And anybody who goes back to Vietnam ought to visit those to really just get a full grasp of what was going on. But occasionally, tunnel rats would go in and they'd flush out one of these tunnels in the area where we were, and we'd get patients in. Unbelievable. Broken limbs in these see-through casts, maggots running up and down the legs, and covered with dirt, just filthy, filthy, filthy. I think all of us had some sort of spiritual background or spirituality, whether it was, whether it was organized religion, or you just, what do they say, you find religion when you need it, or something like that.
No atheists in the foxhole?
That's the expression. But I don't know what was going through my mind, to be honest with you. Sometimes it was just a blur, and it was the physical sense of holding a hand, and yet we were maybe even at the same time communicating with something else that was going on, and, asking questions or answering. It just depended on the situation. If we only had one or two casualties, then it was probably a more interactive sort of thing. Otherwise, it was more I am here, but there's all this hubbub going on, and you're dealing with a lot of different things at one time. Vietnam was not a war where the enemy had a really different face from everybody else. When you saw a Vietnamese person, you weren't quite sure whether they were friend or enemy, which created lots of issues for the guys out in the field. And, sometimes you could get a feel for the fact that you thought, well, maybe the enemy looks different, but they really didn't. I mean, a big issue was not just incoming mortar rounds, but snipers that would snip wires and crawl in and just mingle with the rest of the, of the South Vietnamese friendlies. So that was, I think, a big issue in Vietnam, is that there were too many people looking alike. I guess that sounds strange, but it's really true. And it's similar to what we hear now with suicide bombers and things, strapping things onto children. There were women, children who fought for the other side, for the cause, and so you did not know whether that child you were looking at was friendly or not. And there were also, quote, front lines in the other wars. There were no front lines in Vietnam. I mean, we would take mortar attacks. The North Vietnamese seemed to celebrate the seasons and the holidays by bombing us. So we would get incoming rockets like on the vernal equinox and the autumnal equinox and that sort of, and the Tet Offensive, of course, was around the New Year's time period. But they really, that was just something. There were no front lines. It wasn't like, okay, you're there and I'm here and I'm going to shoot you because you're in front of me. It was all around. It was all around, so there was no really no. Well, I think when I arrived, I think I had the Florence Nightingale syndrome, which was I was going to save the world and I was going to save lives and I was doing wonderful, wonderful work, which I did. I mean, I think every day we saved lives. There's an old joke in nursing school. We'd go off to, the hospital to save lives, and we never really saved lives, but we truly were saving lives every day. I would like to think that we would learn from our past. I'm not sure right now we have learned from our past, but I would like to think that the more we talk about what war really is, it's not Rambo and it's not the movies you see, it's reality. And I think the more we can speak to that, the better we can educate young minds.